That morning, before the court assembled and before the elders arrived from the northern territories, the castle awoke with its usual discipline. Servants hurried through the corridors. Advisors exchanged hushed conversations in half-open doorways. The scent of firewood, damp linen, and polished steel mingled with the cold air drifting down from the tall windows. Everything appeared ready for another ordinary ceremony, another audience, another morning in which the kingdom would pretend everything was normal. Only Marvella, perhaps, understood how badly that normalcy had already cracked beneath the surface. She knew the castle better than she knew her own childhood. For decades, she had crossed the Great Hall with the bearing of someone who never needed to ask for space, even though that was precisely what she had been forced to do every single day. She was the queen, the Luna, the king's wife, keeper of traditions, steward of lands, the respectable face of a kingdom that enjoyed appearing honorable whenever it was convenient. And yet there were days when she felt invisible within her own walls. That morning, Isolde walked through those doors, the king's newest guest, young, beautiful, with the calculating eyes of someone who had learned early that survival is rarely a matter of luck, and almost always a matter of strategy. And beneath her gown, everyone whispered in nervous, excited voices, she carried the king's sextuplets. The sextuplets of the man to whom Marvella had devoted decades of her life. The man whose hand she had held through nights of fever, whose decisions she had defended when the council faltered, whose name she had carried as though it belonged to both of them. And now that same man stood ready to place a young woman at the center of the court, expecting Marvella to remain where she was, to smile, to nod politely, to accept life as the shadow of a lie he had not even bothered to conceal with care, as though 53 years of loyalty could be folded away inside a courteous silence, as though she were not one of the foundations holding the weight of the entire kingdom together, as though public humiliation were not enough, and he still expected her to shelter it beneath her own roof, offer it a seat at her table, call it the future, while the past, the woman who had built everything standing around them, quietly stepped aside without complaint. But Reynold, who had always believed himself the guardian of his own authority, had no idea he was about to confront the thing he feared most. A woman who had finally stopped accepting silence as her destiny. And the first crack had already begun to spread. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The throne room smelled of beeswax candles and the most expensive lie Marvella had witnessed in 78 years of life. She stood beside her husband, Alpha King Reynold of the Silvercrest bloodline, with her spine straight as it had always been, her hands folded before her as they had been for decades. 53 years of marriage. 53 years as this kingdom's Luna. 53 years learning to recognize the exact weight of the silence that came before disaster. This silence was 22 years old, and her name was Isolde. She stepped through the great oak doors with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the entrance more than once, and Marvella, who knew every carefully practiced gesture in court life, recognized the performance immediately. Dark hair, young skin, and a rounded belly pressing against her travel dress with the unmistakable confidence of someone who knew exactly what weapon she carried. 6 babies, Counselor Fabio murmured under his breath, sounding equally horrified and fascinated. Marvella didn't look at him. Her eyes remained on Reynold. Her husband was 82. His hair was completely white, and since last winter he had relied on a cane after his left knee decided it was no longer interested in cooperating with the rest of his body. She knew him so well she could read stress in the angle of his shoulders before his face revealed anything at all. And in that moment, Reynold's shoulders said with painful clarity, "She's here." So this was how she found out. Not in a private conversation. Not during a difficult moment of honesty, not with the dignity 53 years deserved, but in the throne room, before 40 witnesses, while a 22-year-old woman crossed the distance between the columns carrying 6 unborn heirs like a battle standard. At last, Reynolds looked at her. She recognized that expression too. It was the look of a man who had made a terrible decision a long time ago and spent months convincing himself that the right time to explain it was always tomorrow. "Marvella," he began, and from the very first syllable she knew the explanation would be long and the apology painfully short. "Isolde she's here to stay. The pups are my heirs. I need you to understand." "I understand perfectly," Marvella said. Her voice was so calm, so perfectly level, that Counselor Fabio instinctively took a step sideways. And in that moment, she understood, with the peculiar clarity that accompanies truths one already knows and merely waits to confirm, that there was nothing left to save, no conversation to have, no compromise to reach, no version of this room in which she remained standing beside her husband, while his young mistress occupied the place that belonged to her after decades of loyalty, as though Marvella were an antique piece of furniture that could simply be replaced with a newer model. She was not furniture. "All right," she said, her voice still carrying that same surgical calm. "Then let's discuss what belongs to me." Reynolds frowned. "Marvella, this isn't necessary right now." "My dowry," she interrupted, counting on her fingers. 10,000 silver coins brought from the Miravel line when we married. The Golden Hill Estates, registered in my name before our mating ceremony. Master cartographer Semio's map collection, gifted to me by my father when I was 15. And the southern trade route contracts I personally negotiated during the grain crisis 18 years ago while you were bedridden with fever. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of 40 people pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. "You can't just—" "I can," Marvella replied, "because they legally belong to me. Every asset was registered before I ever crossed this castle's gates as your Luna. My mother, who was smarter than both of us combined, insisted on it, and I was wise enough to listen." Counselor Fabio cleared his throat. Young Isolde, who had stopped several yards away with one hand resting protectively on her stomach, in a gesture Marvella noticed immediately but did not yet fully understand, watched her with a mixture of caution and something that might have been admiration under different circumstances. "Luna Marvella," Isolde said, her voice steadier than expected. "I didn't come here to replace you." "My dear," Marvella replied without a trace of cruelty, only the weary patience of a woman who had survived 53 years of court politics. "You already have. The question now is what leaves with me." She looked at Reynolds one final time. Those gray eyes, the eyes she had loved for decades. She searched them for something. Real remorse. Not the performative guilt of a man caught in an uncomfortable situation, but the genuine sorrow of someone who understood the magnitude of what he had done. What she found was too complicated to name. "I need 3 days to organize what belongs to me," she said. "You can give me that." It wasn't a question. Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said quietly. 3 days. Marvella nodded once, with the efficiency of someone confirming a business arrangement. Then she turned and walked from the throne room with her back straight, her hands steady, and her footsteps firm against the stone mosaic she herself had overseen 31 years earlier. Behind her, the room finally exhaled. From the corridor, she could hear Counselor Fabio resuming the ceremony with the professional and slightly desperate competence of a man attempting to make an utterly abnormal situation sound completely normal. Marvella turned toward the east wing. Only then did she allow her hands to tremble. Briefly, for exactly 6 steps. Then she silenced them again. 78 years old, 53 years of marriage, 3 days to dismantle an entire life. Then she had better start now. On the second floor of the Eastern Tower, inside one of the private chambers where she stored documents no one else knew existed, Marvella found exactly what she expected to find: her life on paper, meticulously organized, waiting for the day it might be needed. And beside her, perched atop a storage chest with an expression balanced somewhere between outrage and wounded pride after hearing everything through the open window, sat Duca. Duca was 46 years old, had served as chief housekeeper of the Eastern Tower for 22 years, possessed a crisis vocabulary that somehow combined court etiquette with the blunt honesty of a woman who had long ago stopped fearing consequences, and was, in Marvella's opinion, the most useful person in the entire castle. "I heard everything," Duca said. "I know. That belly is substantial. Apparently there are 6 of them." Duca sat in silence for a moment. "And he expected you to just accept all this?" She waved both hands vaguely through the air, momentarily too incredulous to find the proper words. "Yes," Marvella answered, her heart aching. "I believe he did." Duca climbed down from the chest with the solemnity of someone making an important decision. "I need coffee," she declared. "And a list. Tell me what needs moving, and I'll handle the rest." Marvella looked at her with the particular gratitude reserved for people who know better than to ask useless questions during critical moments. "We start with the map library," she said, "and the southern contracts." "And the blue china set in the dining hall?" Duca asked, already reaching for paper and charcoal. "The blue china predates the current calendar by 1,743 years, Marvella replied. "It's mine, obviously." Duca wrote it down. "And the library curtains?" "I bought them with my dowry." "Noted. And the rose bushes in the south garden that you planted 40 years ago?" Marvella stared at her. "Duca." "Yes, Luna." "You're conducting an extremely detailed inventory for someone who was sitting on a chest in shock 10 minutes ago." Duca raised the charcoal with dignity. "When I'm nervous, I organize things. It's my coping mechanism. And right now, I'm organizing your departure with the efficiency that 53 years of service deserves. Do you have a problem with that?" Something shifted inside Marvella's chest. Not happiness. Not yet. But the recognition that some things still mattered. Some people still mattered. "None at all," she said. "Carry on." Duca did. And somewhere back in the throne room, Counselor Fabio was probably attempting to explain to 40 witnesses that what had just happened was somehow standard court procedure. Good luck with that, Fabio, Marvella thought as she opened the second file drawer. She had work to do. On the morning of the second day, Marvella discovered the debts. Not by accident. Nothing Marvella did was ever accidental. She had summoned the kingdom's accountant, a man named Pedroso, who perspired even on cold mornings and had spent the last 15 years trying to convince her not to pay too much attention to financial records, and instructed him to bring the complete balance sheets of the realm. Pedroso sweated even more than usual. "Your Grace," he said, clutching the ledger against his chest like a shield. "Perhaps this isn't the most appropriate time to—" "Pedroso," Marvella said, seated at a table in the antechamber with a cup of tea Duca had somehow produced with an efficiency that seemed to defy the laws of time and space. "You have exactly 2 options. You hand me those numbers willingly, or I access the treasury records myself, and then you explain why you felt the need to hide them." Pedroso handed over the numbers. Duca, standing against the wall with a piece of charcoal frozen above her notes, raised an eyebrow when she saw the expression on Marvella's face as she read. She said nothing. She waited. The debts were extensive. Not the kind that accumulate after a harsh winter or a streak of bad luck. These were the debts that come from rushed decisions and poor judgment. Supply contracts renegotiated under unfavorable terms. Loans taken out to finance construction projects that had begun without approved budgets. Trade agreements replacing the very arrangements Marvella had negotiated during the grain crisis with significantly worse alternatives. There was a pattern, Every single problem traced back 2 years. "Pedroso," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "How long has King Reynold been renegotiating the southern contracts without informing the council?" Pedroso began sweating in an entirely different way. "My lady, I'm not your Luna anymore," Marvella said. "So don't call me that. Answer the question." 18 months, Pedroso replied quietly. 18 months. Exactly when Isolde had entered Reynolds' life, according to the timeline Marvella had already assembled while reviewing the documents. He had begun dismantling the agreements she built in order to finance whatever had been happening beyond the court's knowledge. She closed the ledger carefully. "Thank you, Pedroso," she said. "You may go." Pedroso departed with the unmistakable speed of a man fully aware he had escaped something that could have gone far worse. Duca approached the table. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough that creditors will come knocking within 6 months once word spreads that the kingdom's leadership has changed." "And how exactly will they find out?" "Because I'm leaving with what belongs to me," Marvella said. "And what remains won't cover what's owed." Duca fell silent. "So he's in serious trouble?" "Yes." Another pause. Then Duca asked in a different tone, "Does he know?" Marvella considered the question honestly. "I think he expected me to stay," she said at last. "I think, in his mind, I would remain silent because divorce isn't common. He assumed tradition would be stronger than pride." "What a spectacular miscalculation." "Very much so." She folded the financial reports with precision, placed them inside the archive she was taking with her, and rose from her chair with the deliberate ease she had perfected over the years whenever her knees decided to protest. 78 years old. She'd had worse days. "Is the large wagon ready?" she asked. "Since 6 this morning," Duca replied. "The blue china set, the maps, the protocol books, the southern garden plants in transport pots, the library curtains, and the southern contracts." She paused. "And the mattress." Marvella looked at her. "The mattress?" "You bought it with your dowry before the wedding. Technically, it belongs to you. Also, it's an excellent mattress." Marvella stared at the ceiling for a moment. "Duca." "Yes?" "You're coming with me." Duca lifted the charcoal. "Obviously," she said. "My bags are already packed. I was simply waiting for the formal invitation out of courtesy." Marvella descended into the courtyard where the wagon stood fully loaded. 2 horses, 1 driver. Bertino had been selected by Duca according to 3 very specific qualifications. He asked very few questions. He handled rain exceptionally well. And he had absolutely no opinions about delicate political situations. Reynolds stood beside the southern gate. Marvella had hoped he wouldn't appear. It would have been easier that way. Not for her. She had slept surprisingly well because her decisions were finally clear. But for him, who appeared to be struggling. He looked older than he had the day before. Or perhaps she was simply seeing him without the familiar filter of 53 years of affection. "Marvella," he said. "Reynold. You don't have to leave." She looked at him calmly, having rehearsed this exact conversation countless times throughout the night. "You brought a 22-year-old woman pregnant with 6 children into my throne room and expected me to remain silent," she said. "I can't do that. Not because I don't want to." Her voice softened by the smallest fraction. Because 53 years were still 53 years. But because staying would mean accepting something I would never tolerate. I have tolerated a great many things out of love. Just not this. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened in the familiar way it always did whenever he lacked an argument and knew it. "The debts," she continued, "will become a problem once the creditors discover what I've taken. You'll want to speak with Pedroso before that happens." Reynold blinked. "Debts?" "Yes. 18 months of renegotiated contracts. The accountant has the numbers. With Duca's assistance delivered with the suspicious efficiency of someone who had clearly practiced this maneuver beforehand, Marvella climbed into the wagon. "Take care of yourself, Reynold." He remained standing at the gate, cane in hand, wearing an expression she could no longer decipher, and no longer tried to. Bertino clicked the reins. The wagon rolled through the southern gate of the castle that had been her home for more than 5 decades. Marvella did not look back. Not because it was easy, because she had spent the entire night practicing that particular act of courage and knew she needed it to be real. Beside her, Duca pulled a small bottle of pear brandy from inside her coat. "It's a little early for that," Marvella observed. "It's medicinal." "For what?" "My knee." "Your knee is fine." "Mine disagrees," Duca said, taking a dignified sip. Marvella looked ahead at the road unfolding before them, the eastern hills, the forest beyond the third bend, and farther still, the Golden Hill estate that had legally belonged to her for more than 50 years. A home, a new order, a beginning stripped of the framework of an entire lifetime. At 78 years old. "Where exactly are we going?" Duca asked as she tucked away the flask. "Golden Hill. The estate that belongs to you? The one that belongs to me." "Well," Duca said, "that settles it." A brief pause. "Bertino, do you know how to get to Golden Hill?" "No," Bertino answered with the serenity of a man entirely free of political opinions. "Excellent," Duca said. "Then Her Grace will need to give directions." So Marvella gave directions, and the wagon continued eastward, carrying blue china, maps, a very expensive mattress, and 53 years of a life that was being placed, with great determination, into a new order. For the past 40 years, the Golden Hill estate had been managed by a man named Gervas, who was 81 years old, and firmly believed that anything happening in royal courts was, at its core, somebody else's problem. When Marvella's wagon arrived late on the second afternoon, Gervas was trimming the rose bushes by the front entrance with the concentration of a man who had long ago discovered his life's calling. "Your Grace?" he said without the slightest surprise. "Gervas," she replied. "I'm not a Luna anymore." He considered that while clipping another branch. "Then what are you?" "The owner of Golden Hill." "That's always been true," he said. "Anything else change?" "A few things." "The house is ready," he said. "Aired out the rooms last week. My knee said you'd be coming. My knee predicts things better than any royal advisor I've ever met." Duca climbed down from the wagon and gave him the particular look of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. "I like this man," she announced. "He's acceptable," Marvella said, which in her vocabulary counted as considerable praise. Golden Hill was a moderately sized estate, not a castle, not a cottage, but something comfortably between the two, built from the warm gray stone of the surrounding hills, with tall windows, a modest but excellent library, and gardens maintained with the devotion of a man who had spent decades treating the task as sacred. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Duca organized crates with the efficiency of someone born specifically for such work, Marvella finally felt the exhaustion. It arrived the way exhaustion always did once movement stopped. Deep, honest, heavy enough to feel real. 78 years old. A body that ached in discrete, familiar places. A life that had ended one chapter 2 days earlier and had not yet begun the next. "You're going to be fine," Duca said without looking up from her work. It wasn't a question. "Eventually," Marvella answered honestly. "That's good enough." Gervas appeared in the doorway carrying a bowl of soup. "Made this for the knee," he said. "Yours or mine?" Marvella asked. "Both." He handed her the bowl. "Soup fixes more things than people realize." Marvella accepted it. It was excellent. Far better than anything the castle cook had prepared in years. "Any neighbors around here?" she asked. "A few." Jervis replied. The Valerio estate is about 2 hours north on horseback. Old Cassian Valerio passed last fall. His son inherited the land. What's the son like? Jervis stirred the air thoughtfully with his spoon. 10 years younger than you. Widower. Looks after the wolves in the northern hills like they belong to him, which most folks consider eccentric. Personally, I think it's sensible. Runs the estate well. Doesn't ask questions that aren't his business. Sounds tolerable. For comparison, Jervis said, that counselor from the castle asks questions that aren't anybody's business and disguises them as neutral observations so nobody notices he's being nosy. So yes, Cassian is tolerable. Duca, who had conveniently stopped organizing in order to listen, wore the expression of someone quietly filing away useful information for later. Marvella ignored her. I'm going to bed. The south bedroom is ready, Jervis said. The mattress from the wagon has already been set up. A very good mattress, Duca added. It always was, Marvella said. She slept. Not immediately. There was too much settling inside her for sleep to come easily. But eventually it arrived. The particular kind of sleep that belongs to a house that is truly yours, in a room that smells of open fields instead of court politics. She was in exile. She had chosen to leave. Both things were true at the same time. And somewhere 2 hours north, a man named Cassian Valerio spent his days caring for lost wolves nobody had asked him to care for. Marvella slept. 3 weeks after arriving at Golden Hill, 2 events occurred almost simultaneously and disrupted what was becoming a comfortable routine. First, a messenger arrived from the castle carrying a letter from Reynold. Second, the messenger tripped over a planter box Duca had left beside the gate, and the resulting crash brought Jervis running from the vegetable garden. He helped the young man to his feet with the patient calm of someone who had witnessed enough of life to find very little surprising anymore. Reynolds' letter was short. The kind of short letter written by a man who doesn't know what to say after realizing there were 100 things he should have said much sooner. The creditors came. You were right. Pedroso is trying to renegotiate. I hope you're well. Marvella read it twice. He got one thing right, she said. Duca had positioned herself at a distance that was technically respectful and practically close enough to read over her shoulder. What's that? That I was right. Duca took the letter, read it, and handed it back. He also said he hopes you're doing well. That counts for something. It's the bare minimum. Still a start, Duca said. It wasn't exactly comfort. More acknowledgement than comfort. Want to answer him? Marvella considered it. Not yet. There was something strange about leaving the castle with everything that belonged to her. She had expected to feel lighter, and in many ways she did. But there was a new weight as well. The weight of being a complete person without the structure of 5 decades surrounding her. The weight of having to decide, for the first time in a very long while, what came next. It was unsettling. She was determined to face it practically. And it was while living in that state of practical uncertainty that she heard the wolves the following morning. There were 2 of them. Too young to be alone, judging by the scent. They were hiding near the eastern boundary beneath a loose section of stone wall that Jervis maintained in generally good condition, though never perfect condition. She found them because she had gone walking at 6 in the morning after another restless night, and because the gardens carried that unmistakable late autumn scent she had loved since childhood. The 2 wolves looked at her as though uncertain whether she was dangerous or useful. You 2 shouldn't be here, she said. The smaller one gave a soft growl, a response she interpreted as, and you should? Marvella stood quietly for a moment as the rising sun painted the stones of Golden Hill in shades of silver and gold. Fair point, she admitted. Then she went to find Jervis. Who fetched food? Which brought Duca? Who looked at the wolves with the expression of someone who already knew life had just become more complicated in a way that would probably turn out to be wonderful. They're from the Valerio lands, Hervas said. Can smell the northern hills on them. Must have wandered off during the night. Someone should notify their owner, Duca said. I could go, Jervis offered. You're 81 and your knee predicts weather, Duca replied. I could go. You don't know the road. Then Duca looked at Marvella. There was a particular tone in her voice, one Marvella immediately recognized as, here comes an inconvenient opportunity. Your Grace, Duca said carefully, this might be a good chance to meet the neighbor. The wolves stared at her with enormous golden eyes. Marvella looked back at them, then at the clear sky, then at the road winding north through the hills. 78 years old, and inconvenient new beginnings remained inconvenient. Bertino, she called, prepare the horse. Cassian Valerio was 68 years old and repairing a fence when she arrived. That was the first thing Marvella noticed. His hands were on the fence, not supervising someone else repairing the fence. Actually repairing it. There was a difference, and she had spent decades learning how to tell the two apart. The second thing she noticed was that he heard the horse before he saw her. He looked up without hurry and did not make the expression men often made when they saw a woman with completely silver hair riding alone across the countryside. The expression that searched for an explanation. The expression that said, this is unusual. Instead, he simply waited with the same calm steadiness as the fence itself. Good morning, Marvella said as she dismounted with the careful ease she had developed for maintaining dignified knees. I'm the new owner of Golden Hill. I believe I found two of yours. She opened the basket secured to the saddle. The two young wolves looked up with the unmistakable expression of creatures who knew they had done something questionable and felt absolutely no remorse about it. Cassian looked at the wolves, then at Marvella. One eyebrow lifted. Bronze and sage, he said. They slipped away during the night. Thank you for bringing them back. Are they yours? She asked, because ownership seemed unclear. They belong to the hills, he said. They show up when they're lost. I keep them until someone recognizes them, or until they're old enough to find a pack of their own. She lifted the wolves from the basket. They immediately made their way toward Cassian with the easy familiarity of creatures who had done this before. Jervis told me you take in lost wolves. Jervis talks too much. Was he telling the truth? Cassian tucked Bronze beneath one arm with the unconscious ease of long practice. Yes. Why? The question came out more directly than she intended, but she had spent decades asking the polished version of difficult questions, and she was discovering that at 78, there were certain formalities no longer worth the time they required. Cassian appeared entirely unbothered. Because somebody has to, he said. And because it costs a lot less than people think. She studied him for a moment. You lost someone. It wasn't a question. He looked up. My mate, he said. 6 years ago. We never had children. The lost wolves started showing up after that. I'm not sure whether I chose them or they chose me. There was an honesty in that answer Marvella recognized immediately. Not the kind of honesty people display. The kind that simply exists because someone has stopped seeing any value in pretending otherwise. Marvella, she said. Former Luna of King Reynolds' court. Current owner of Golden Hill. Apparently also someone who finds wolves at 6 a.m. when she ought to be sleeping. Cassian, he replied. Someone who repairs fences that are already perfectly adequate because it's a task that doesn't require too much thinking. The wolves were climbing onto his shoulders with the confidence of creatures who had decided this arrangement was entirely acceptable. If any more turn up, Marvella said, my property is south of here. If you ever need someone who knows the roads through these hills, Cassian replied, my property is north of here. She nodded, mounted her horse, carefully. Former Luna, Cassian called. She turned. Welcome to Golden Hill. That was all. Just recognition. No excessive sympathy. No intrusive questions about who she had once been. No awkward discomfort from someone witnessing the fall of a powerful woman and not knowing how to react. Just welcome. Thank you, she said, and she rode south along the winding road, while the autumn air of Golden Hill carried the scent of cold stone and something else she could not yet name. Something that, given enough time, would eventually find its name. Back at the estate, Duca was waiting at the gate with the unmistakable expression of someone who had spent the last 2 hours developing theories. "How was it?" she asked. "I found the wolves." "And the neighbor?" "He's tolerable." Duca nodded with a satisfaction that required no further explanation. "The castle messenger came back," she said. "Another letter." Marvella dismounted. "From whom?" "The young woman." Duca paused. "Isolde." There was something in her tone, not judgment, attention. That Marvella had not expected. She entered the house, sat at the small library desk that had become her workspace, and opened the letter. Isolde's handwriting was good, not the decorative script taught to noble daughters, but the practical handwriting of someone who wrote often and had no interest in impressing anyone. "Lady Marvella, I know you have no reason to read this letter. I also know there is probably nothing I can say that will change what happened or what was lost, but I was trained as a physician before I became anything else that circumstances later required me to be, and my training obligates me to be honest. There is something about the sextuplets that I cannot make King Reynold understand because he is not listening. I do not know how to explain it without sounding manipulative or as though I am seeking sympathy. But I know you always listened to difficult truths for what they were rather than for what was convenient. That is why I am writing to you and not to anyone else. Something is wrong. I am writing about the babies, not about myself. If you can receive this letter with the seriousness the situation deserves, I would be grateful." Isolde Marvella remained seated for a long moment with the letter open before her. Duca entered carrying tea. She looked at Marvella's expression. She did not ask questions. She set down the cup and waited. "There's something wrong with the pregnancy," Marvella said. Duca remained silent. "She writes like a physician," Marvella continued. "Not like a guilty mistress, not like a frightened young woman, like a physician. And do you believe her?" Marvella folded the letter. She thought about Isolde's shoulders in the throne room, tense in a way that had gone beyond ordinary nerves. She thought about the hand pressed protectively against her stomach, the gesture she had noticed and filed away without understanding. "Not yet," she said, "but something about this bothers me in the same way all important things bother me before they're properly examined. What are you going to do?" Marvella looked through the window at the gardens Jervis had kept in perfect order. "For now," she said, "nothing. I have my own life to rebuild." She glanced at the folded letter. "But I'm keeping it." And she did. That afternoon, while Duca organized the library, Jervis trimmed plants that probably did not require trimming, and Bertino occupied himself with whatever coachmen do when they are not actively coaching. Marvella sat in the garden with a bowl of soup and the autumn sky above her, and allowed herself the rare luxury of thinking without direction. 78 years old, a new estate, a neighbor who collected lost wolves, a letter from a young woman who wrote like a physician, and somewhere to the east, a castle burdened by growing debt, and an alpha king who had badly misjudged what she would do. It was a lot. And it was nowhere near enough to know what came next. But it was enough, she realized with the particular honesty that comes only after one stops lying to oneself, to keep moving forward. And for now, that was enough. The law of the moon's reflection was so old that most people no longer believed it was an actual law. Marvella had learned about it when she was 12 years old, because her mother, precisely the kind of woman who stored inconvenient knowledge until it became useful, had shown it to her in the only surviving book that mentioned it, a deer-hide volume that smelled like 40 years of unopened library shelves. The law itself was simple, which was probably why people had stopped taking it seriously. When a Luna leaves her position for just cause, the mating bond magic that sustains the territory begins to unravel. Not immediately, gradually. The way a waning moon does not disappear all at once, but loses a little light each night until renewal comes. Renewal, according to the law, meant one of two things. Either the Luna returned, or a new, legitimate Luna took her place. Until one of those things happened, the territory entered a state of slow dissolution. Not war. Not obvious catastrophe. Something quieter. Harvests that underperformed. Trade agreements that somehow failed to hold. Creatures abandoning territory for no clear reason. Marvella had thought about it once or twice since leaving the castle, then dismissed it as superstition. Cassian was the one who told her it wasn't. Over the following weeks, they had developed the kind of routine that emerges between people who share the same stretch of road. Once a week, sometimes twice, usually under some practical excuse. A wolf to return, a question about property boundaries, the time Duca sent Marvella north carrying a basket of pears from the old orchard because there were simply too many pears, and Duca had calculated, with remarkable precision, that a basket of fruit was exactly the sort of thing that made encounters feel less awkwardly formal. Cassian had accepted the pears with the seriousness of a man evaluating the matter from the orchard's perspective, then informed her that the old tree produced the finest pears on the hill. A statement she found both understandable and faintly suspicious. This afternoon, however, he arrived at Golden Hill carrying a different expression. Not urgency. Cassian did not experience urgency the way younger people did. But there was something there. Something that said, "There is a matter that needs discussing, and I am choosing the moment carefully." "I heard something in Merivale," he said. They were seated on a garden bench while Jervis discreetly provided tea with the satisfaction of a man who performed such services entirely for his own enjoyment. "About the castle?" Marvella asked. "The Eastern merchants passed through town yesterday," Cassian said. "The territory's harvests have been underperforming for 2 months now." Marvella listened. "The merchants blame the weather. And? The elder wolves blame something else." She was silent. "They've invoked the law of the moon's reflection." "Does it actually exist as law?" she asked carefully, "or merely as tradition?" It irritated her slightly that she wasn't entirely sure of the answer herself. "It exists," Cassian said. The certainty in his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had lived close enough to understand. "When my mate died, there were 6 months of instability before the elders formally recognized me as the territory holder. During that period, the law was considered suspended, not actively dissolving." He paused. But if she had left because she'd been wronged, because she had been dishonored and pushed away, the unraveling would have happened much faster. Marvella studied the stone path beneath her feet. "You're telling me the castle territory is weakening because I left. I'm telling you that's what the elders are considering. And that I should go back." "No." The firmness surprised her. "No one has the right to ask that of you," Cassian continued. "What I am saying is that there are innocent people who will suffer if this continues. Farmers, merchants, wolf packs that depend on a stable territory." Marvella sat with that thought. That, she realized, was the difference between questions that mattered and questions that didn't. Not what she owed Reynold, what happened to people who had never chosen any of this. "There's a third option," she said quietly. "Which is?" "The law allows for a Luna representative." The memory surfaced slowly from the old book she had read decades ago. "Not a Luna. Someone granted delegated authority. If I formally appoint a representative, the dissolution stops." "You would have to be alive and in good standing to make the appointment." "I'm alive." The dryness of her tone made him glance at her before realizing she was being sarcastic. "You'd also need an elder witness." "I know 3 elder wolves who owe me favors," she said. "Favors I never collected because I never needed them." Cassian regarded her with that thoughtful attention she had begun recognizing as his version of deep consideration. "Why didn't you call them in?" "Because I lived at the castle and had no reason to." A simple answer. "But I live here now." She looked toward the northern hills. "And apparently I'm going to need witnesses." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that develops between people who no longer feel obligated to fill every quiet moment with conversation. "Marvella, Cassian. I could serve as one of the witnesses." She looked at him. There was no politeness in the offer, no obligation. It was the very specific offer of someone who had calculated the personal cost and decided it was acceptable. Why? The same direct question she had asked the first time they met. He considered it honestly. "Because the lost wolves from your hills cross into mine every week," he said. "And there's no way to care for one side without caring about the other." A practical answer. And somehow more than practical. "I need time to think." "Of course." He stayed a little longer. They discussed other things, the pairs among them. One had apparently been discovered with the bite marks of a very small wolf, suggesting someone had conducted an unauthorized orchard inspection, probably Bronze, who still had only a vague understanding of private property. When Cassian finally left, Marvella remained on the garden bench while the afternoon sun settled across the stones of Golden Hill. Gervis appeared nearby and began watering a corner of the garden that clearly did not need water. "What do you think?" she asked. "About the plants?" "About Cassian." Gervis thoughtfully watered an already damp shrub. "My knee says he's trustworthy." Marvella sighed. "Your knee judges character now?" "Ever since the surgery in 1847. My knees had excellent instincts." He said it with complete sincerity. Marvella stared across the garden. There were lost wolves that needed stability, farmers and merchants who had done nothing to deserve the situation unfolding around them. A letter from a young physician insisting something was wrong. There was Cassian Valerio, a man who repaired fences that didn't need repairing, who cared for lost wolves, who knew the oldest law in the territory because he had lived close enough to understand its consequences. And then there was herself, 78 years old, a new home, a life dismantled and slowly rebuilt into something different. "Duca," she called. Duca appeared instantly in the library window with the efficiency of someone who had already been waiting to be summoned. "Yes, Your Grace?" "Write to the 3 elders." Duca vanished, reappeared moments later carrying paper and charcoal. "And write to Isolde as well." Duca stopped. "To Isolde?" "She said something is wrong with the pregnancy," Marvella said. "If something is wrong, we need to understand it before it becomes a problem larger than the 2 people involved." Duca wrote that down while carefully storing several opinions for future use. "And the neighbor?" she asked. Marvella looked toward the northern road winding through the hills toward the Valerio estate. "As for the neighbor," she said, "not yet." But privately she acknowledged that not yet was very different from never. Nearby, Gervas continued watering plants that clearly required no assistance. Autumn at Golden Hill smelled of stone and pears and something else still taking shape. Isolde was alone in the south bedroom when she realized the lie could no longer fit inside her. The window stood slightly open, allowing a ribbon of cold air to slip into the room and make the oil lamp flicker on the desk. Shadows trembled across the pale walls, stretching and shifting as though they moved with her breathing. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers gripping the fabric of her cloak as if a piece of wool could somehow support the weight of her remaining courage. The room was too quiet. Even the hallway offered no distractions from the noise of her own thoughts. And for Isolde, that was the worst kind of silence, the kind that forced her to listen to the truth she had spent weeks avoiding. There were no children. She had known it for days. known it with the dry certainty of a physician reading test results and understanding the diagnosis before the body stops pretending. She knew because the exhaustion did not follow the pattern of pregnancy. She knew because her abdomen, instead of changing naturally, responded to illusion magic the way paint clings to weathered wood. She knew because the potion given to her by an underground healer sustained no life at all. Only the illusion of weight, warmth, movement, presence. And yet she had continued using the word pregnancy as though repeating it often enough might transform deception into destiny. She rubbed her face and let out a short laugh that died before it fully emerged. Well, she muttered to herself, this is certainly one way to end up exiled. It wasn't pure regret. Isolde was far too intelligent for simple regret. It was calculation. It had always been calculation. The difference was that tonight the calculation had begun demanding payment. On the bedside table sat two objects, a pouch of dried herbs, and a small silver mirror she had used to reinforce the illusion for months. When the lamplight touched them together, Isolde saw what no one in the castle seemed willing to see. The herb pouch was nearly empty. The mirror carried a thin crack through its center, the same crack she had felt growing over the past few days whenever the false pregnancy seemed less convincing beneath the touch of curious hands. The illusion was unraveling. Slowly, she rose and crossed to the window. Outside, Golden Hill slept beneath its own shadows. Wind whispered through the trees. She closed her eyes. She had not deceived Reynold for love. That would have been far nobler than the truth. She deceived him because she knew exactly what he wanted to hear. An aging king surrounded by anxious advisors and increasingly terrified of leaving a throne without heirs was a predictable man. And predictable men could be guided by necessity, the way oxen were guided by an invisible rope. When she first arrived at the castle months earlier, she noticed Reynold's loneliness with the precision of someone who had learned to survive by noticing such things. He looked at her as though her youth could somehow conceal every crack in his history. And she, who had grown up recognizing hunger disguised as devotion, understood immediately that all she had to offer was the promise he wanted most: protection, position, time. The problem was that time had started charging interest. The first time Reynold asked to touch her stomach, she nearly stopped breathing. Not from guilt, from panic. Because beneath the robes and enchantments, the pregnancy was exactly what it had always been: fabric, magic. Carefully weighted cushions secured beneath her clothing. Nothing more. No life, no heartbeat, no tiny soul moving beneath her skin. Only the cruel ability to appear real long enough to convince a king who had long ago stopped questioning his own desires. Isolde opened her eyes and stared at her fractured reflection. I should have ended this sooner. The fear no longer came from being exposed. Exposure had always been part of the risk. The fear was something else. The possibility that the lie had grown beyond her control and was now damaging the territory itself. Because she had noticed things. The strange quiet in the hallways, the growing unease among the animals, the moment 2 nights earlier when she crossed the great hall and felt the castle's magic hesitate around her, like a hand suddenly uncertain of the face it was touching. The mask had worked too well, and now the bond itself was beginning to reject her. She walked to the door and cracked it open. Footsteps echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. The corridor was empty. Still, she stepped back. There was a particular instinct possessed by people who had pushed their luck too far. The instinct that recognizes the sound of the cliff before it appears. Then she understood something that made her slowly sit down again. If Marvella discovered the truth, it would not merely humiliate her. It would destroy the entire story she had built. The king would lose authority. The elders would demand answers. Contracts would be reviewed. Alliances would shift. And Isolde would cease to be the young woman carrying heirs and become what she had always been beneath the performance. An ordinary woman. Ambitious. Beautiful. Perhaps useful, but easily discarded. She hated that word. Discarded. That was why she had created the lie in the first place. Not because she was innocent, because she refused to become invisible. A knock sounded at the door. Isolde jumped so quickly that the chair scraped across the floor. "Who is it?" "Lady Marvella requests your presence." The voice beyond the door was calm, controlled. Duca. Isolde closed her eyes for a moment. Cold sweat gathered between her fingers. Then she smoothed her cloak, took one breath, then another, and forced her face into an expression that still resembled dignity. When she opened the door, Duca stood waiting with her hands folded neatly before her and the sharp gaze of someone who had already figured out half the problem without hearing a single confession. "Good evening," Duca said. "Good evening." Duca studied her, and for the first time since arriving at Golden Hill, Isolde felt she was facing someone who could not be fooled by politeness, intimidated by status, or persuaded by tears. "She wants to see you in the library," Duca said. "Alone, no king, no accountant, no performance." Isolde swallowed. "Is it about the pregnancy?" The question was dead before it finished leaving her mouth. Duca did not answer immediately. That alone was enough to send ice through her veins. "Go," Duca said at last. "And if I were you, I'd choose every word very carefully." Isolde walked down the corridor with steps that were far too light for someone trying to appear composed. The house rested in silence. Every closed door seemed to watch. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her feet, and she had the unpleasant feeling she was not walking into a conversation. She was walking into a courtroom without signs. Marvella stood waiting beside the central table when she entered the library. There was no theatrical anger on the former Luna's face. What existed was worse, an ancient calm. The calm of a woman who had seen too many lies to be impressed by the next one. Cassian sat quietly in a chair near the wall. He did not interfere. He merely observed, as though his presence existed to ensure the room remained balanced no matter where the truth happened to fall. Marvella gestured toward the chair opposite her. "Sit." Isolde obeyed. The lamp on the table cast enough light that nothing in the room could remain hidden for very long. Marvella folded her hands. "Let's skip the useless part," she said. "You and I both know the story about sextuplets doesn't hold together." The room became very still. "The only question is why." Isolde froze. Her heart beat once, then again, as if searching her chest for an escape route. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do," Marvella interrupted. Her voice never rose. "You understand enough to know there's no point lying to me inside this house." She leaned forward slightly. "So let's save ourselves some time." Cassian did not move, not a single muscle. Yet Isolde noticed the subtle shift of his weight. Not a threat. Attention. She looked back at Marvella and saw something no young mistress ever wants to see in the eyes of an experienced Luna. Patience. The patience required to dismantle a lie one piece at a time. Isolde drew a long breath and decided to stop pretending. Isolde didn't look up right away. The library felt larger with silence inside it. Lamplight slid across the tall bookshelves, spilling over worn bindings and casting narrow shadows across the wooden floor. The air smelled of paper, wax, and the cold creeping through the gaps around the windows. Her breathing felt too shallow, fragile, uneven, as if her entire body already understood that the lie was over long before her mouth admitted it. Marvella remained standing. No cruelty, no impatience. That was what frightened Isolde most. There would be no outburst, no dramatic accusations. Only a woman too old to be deceived and too clear-minded to waste energy on theatrics. Beside her, Cassian sat quietly, the way someone sits when they have chosen to be a witness and support rather than a judge. Oddly enough, that made everything harder. There was no room for performance when someone in the room refused to participate in the illusion. "Speak," Marvella said. Her voice was low, steady. "No detours." Isolde clasped her hands together. For a brief moment she considered denying everything, claiming there had been a misunderstanding, claiming the illusion magic still carried some trace of truth, claiming Reynold had misunderstood the early examinations. But she could almost physically feel that any further deception would only deepen the fall. The library was too quiet for large lies. Every false word seemed destined to strike the walls and return. Slowly, she raised her head. "There are no children," she said. The words emerged weaker than she intended. There never were. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear a log crack in the fireplace down the hall. Marvella didn't move. She simply watched. "Go on." Isolde swallowed. This time there was nowhere left to hide humiliation behind beauty, or fear behind posture. "I invented the pregnancy. I used enchanted mirrors, herbal compounds, and appearance magic to imitate the signs the king expected to see. I knew he wanted an heir. I knew he was vulnerable. I knew that if I offered him the thing he wanted most, he would keep me close and protect me from being cast aside." Her voice faltered. She hated that it faltered. "I needed time." Cassian looked away first. Not from discomfort, from restraint. He wasn't there to enjoy her downfall. Marvella remained perfectly still. "Time for what?" A bitter laugh escaped Isolde, humorless. "To avoid disappearing." She stared at the floor. To avoid becoming disposable. To avoid going back to being nobody. She drew a shaky breath. "The king brought me into court as though I were the future. But I knew that without something tangible, I would only be temporary. A distraction. A passing fascination." She closed her eyes briefly. "And I refused to be small. Not after I saw how desperately he wanted to believe." The word desperately lingered in the room. Precise. Uncomfortable. True. Marvella rested her fingertips on the table. "So you lied because you wanted permanence." "Yes. And because you wanted power." Isolde opened her eyes. "Yes." Cassian remained silent. But his stillness no longer felt like observation. It felt like a deliberate decision not to interfere where the confession itself was dismantling her more thoroughly than any attack ever could. Marvella stepped closer. "You understand this isn't merely a personal embarrassment, don't you?" Slowly, Isolde nodded. "I do now." Her voice dropped. The castle started reacting. The hallways changed. The animals became uneasy. The bond magic grew unstable. "That's why I requested this meeting. I knew I couldn't hide it forever." She hesitated. "And I became afraid the lie was causing damage beyond myself." Marvella studied her face without offering easy sympathy. "The herbs? The potion?" "They were designed to imitate weight, warmth, and the sensation of life." Isolde swallowed. "There was no pregnancy, only performance. I learned the rituals from a healer near the border who worked with desperate women. Some needed to hide pregnancies, some needed to fake them, some were simply trying to survive dangerous men." A pause. "I used what I learned for my own benefit." The admission tasted bitter. Marvella listened without changing expression. When she spoke again, her voice was even calmer. "That explains the method. A beat, not the character." Isolde lowered her head. "I know." For the first time, everything truly seemed small. Not her body, not her dress, not the carefully maintained image. Small was the logic behind it. Small was the belief that she could bend an entire kingdom around a private deception. Small was the certainty that if she appeared valuable enough, no one would ever question what lay beneath. Marvella waited a few moments longer, as if ensuring there was nothing else hidden in the shadows. Then she asked, "Why pregnancy?" Slowly, Isolde raised her eyes. There was shame there. but something more dangerous as well. Because it's the one thing everyone stops to listen to. Her voice was quiet. A pregnant woman becomes the center of attention. She becomes important. She becomes a priority. She looked down at her hands. I knew that if I arrived as nothing more than another young, beautiful woman, the court would swallow me whole and never even notice. Her gaze lifted again. But if I carried something the king desperately wanted, I would have a voice. I would have influence. I would matter. A pause. Barely more than a breath. I wanted to become impossible to ignore. The answer wasn't pretty. It wasn't sympathetic. But it was honest. And honesty, in that moment, was harsher than any spell. Cassian moved for the first time, adjusting his hands on his knees. He offered no judgment, no commentary, simply remained there, like a steady anchor beside truths too heavy to carry alone. Marvella sat down across from her, a small gesture, a significant one. By sitting, she leveled the conversation. No throne, no tower, no implied superiority. Only one woman looking at another with the sternness of someone who understood the hunger for survival, but could not accept the path chosen to satisfy it. Isolde, she said softly, almost painfully softly. You did something cruel. Isolde closed her eyes. I know. You humiliated an entire court, manipulated a king, carried a lie larger than your own body could sustain. I know. And do you regret it? The question hung between them. This time the answer didn't come immediately. When Isolde finally opened her eyes, they held fear, shame, and the last stubborn fragment of self-defense refusing to die. I regret the consequences. The words emerged carefully. Not the hunger that brought me here. It would be another lie to claim that. She inhaled. I regret going too far. I regret believing I could control everything. I regret missing the moment when I should have stopped. Marvella held her gaze. That answer is more useful than an apology. Isolde exhaled as though surfacing from deep water. At last Cassian spoke. His voice was low and measured. And Reynold? Does he know? Isolde shook her head. Not completely. He suspects something is wrong. I was trying to buy myself 2 more days before telling him. Her fingers twisted together. 2 days to prepare an exit. Maybe create a version that wasn't quite so catastrophic. A bitter smile touched her lips. But the truth started falling apart before my plans did. Appearance magic always sends the bill eventually. Marvella tilted her head. And the territory is reacting because the bond recognizes the deception. Yes, Isolde nodded. That's why I agreed to speak. I don't want to be responsible for a greater collapse. Then her voice softened. And I don't want the blame to fall on you. That statement struck Marvella harder than any insult could have, because there lay the cruelest truth of all. Isolde understood exactly how much damage she had caused. She understood what she had been asking for the moment she entered that court. She was not merely a young liar trying to escape consequences. She was part of a system that exploited the obsession with heirs, male vanity, and the ancient habit of turning women into functions. Marvella was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was too firm to be mercy and too measured to be revenge. You will repeat all of this before the elders. Isolde went pale, but she did not argue. You will look Reynold in the eye and tell him the entire truth. Not the convenient version, not a softened version. The truth. He'll throw me out. Probably. The brutal honesty made her flinch. And you? The question was barely a whisper. What will you do with me? Marvella regarded her with the unbearable serenity possessed by people who have survived their own suffering and are no longer impressed by manipulation. I will not protect you from consequences, she said, but neither will I turn you into a spectacle to satisfy my pride. A pause. What you did was serious. What happens next will be decided by justice, not resentment. Isolde lowered her head. For the first time since entering the room, she looked small without performing fragility. Simply small. Truly small. And perhaps that was the hardest thing of all. Cassian rose quietly and crossed to the fireplace, not to escape the conversation, to give it room to breathe. He possessed the rare intelligence of knowing when too much presence becomes another weight. Marvella stood as well. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will speak before the elders." Isolde looked up. "Until then, you will remain under my protection in this house." A beat. "Not because I trust you. Another. But because this truth is not ready for the great hall yet." Isolde inhaled, hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." The gratitude sounded awkward, broken, but genuine. Marvella didn't acknowledge it. She turned toward the door, then paused. Without looking back, she said, "Isolde, you wanted to become impossible to ignore." The room fell silent. "You succeeded." A final pause. "Now you'll have to learn what that costs." The door closed softly behind her. Outside in the hallway, Duca was waiting with a covered bowl and the expression of someone who didn't need to hear every word to know the conversation had finally reached the bone. Marvella looked at her. Duca opened her mouth, clearly preparing some sharp remark, then thought better of it. Her expression softened. Only slightly. "I brought soup," she said. Her voice was gentler than usual, for people who've had to swallow too many truths in one evening. Marvella nodded, and for the first time that night, the silence between them required no humor to make it bearable. The following morning arrived without mercy. The sky hung low and gray, and the light filtering through the windows of Golden Hill seemed strained through cold stone itself. Marvella woke before dawn. That had become increasingly common ever since her life stopped following familiar roads. For a few moments she remained in bed, listening to the house breathe around her, the soft crackle of firewood, a quiet movement somewhere in the hallway, the muffled footsteps she immediately recognized as Duca's, already busy before any reasonable person would consider opening their eyes. When she rose, her body protested with the weary dignity of something that had lived a very long time. Her knees took a moment to cooperate. Her lower back objected to the morning chill. She dressed slowly, pinned back her silver hair, and made her way downstairs to the kitchen, where Gervas was already heating water, and Duca sat with a mug in her hands, staring at the table as though organizing the entire day inside her mind. No one felt the need for small talk. This was a morning built for truths too large to share space with empty conversation. A folded note waited beside Marvella's place at the table. Cassian's handwriting. No flourish, no wasted words. The elders would arrive before noon. The king would accompany them. Marvella read it once, then again, then set it beside her mug. "So he finally decided to show up," Duca observed. "Finally," Marvella replied. Gervas looked up from the stove. "And the girl?" "Isolde will be here as well," Marvella said. "There's no point delaying it any longer." A brief silence followed. Not fear, preparation. Cassian arrived shortly afterward, carrying a box of records beneath one arm. He paused in the kitchen doorway and looked at Marvella with that steady calm that had become one of the few reliable things in a changing world. "Ready?" he asked. Marvella met his gaze. "Have been for a while." He nodded, accepting both the answer and the weight behind it. The library was prepared carefully, chairs arranged in a semicircle, documents organized in precise order, Isolde's letter placed at the center of the table. Nothing had been chosen for appearance. Everything was evidence. Everything was consequence. Marvella wanted no theatrics. The truth would be sufficient. When the elders arrived, they carried the expressions of people with no interest in becoming accomplices to someone else's tragedy. Ennio entered first, staff in hand and face stern. Celia followed, composed and sharp-eyed. Lauren looked tired all the way to his bones. Fabio arrived last, carrying the posture of a man who already knew this would be a terrible day, but lacked the luxury of avoiding it. Isolde came shortly afterward. The ornate cloak was gone. She wore a simple dark dress without any trace of the armor she had once worn as the king's favored companion. Her face was pale, not theatrically pale. The pale exhaustion of someone who had not slept, because the lie could no longer survive the night. When she saw Marvella, her gaze faltered briefly, then steadied again. Not because she had found courage, because she no longer had alternatives. Marvella waited until everyone was seated. "Lady Isolde has already confessed part of the fraud," she said quietly. "Today she will confess the rest." Isolde tightened her hands in her lap. The room was so silent that the sound of her fingers rubbing together seemed unnaturally loud. Ennio inclined his head. "Then speak." Isolde drew a long breath. For the first time since arriving at Golden Hill, she appeared genuinely fragile without being false. There was no charm left, no seduction. Only a woman who had pushed her luck beyond every reasonable limit and finally reached the bill. "I was never pregnant." The effect was immediate. No shouting. That would have been easier. Instead, there came something worse. A collective suspension. A moment in which everyone seemed to forget how breathing worked. Marvella remained still. Isolde continued because stopping was no longer possible. "I used herbs, illusion magic, and an enchanted mirror to imitate the signs. I convinced the king I was carrying sextuplets because I knew it would prevent him from sending me away. I knew he wanted an heir badly enough to accept almost any proof." She swallowed. "I needed status. I needed time. And I understood very quickly that unless I became indispensable, I would always be temporary." No one interrupted. The way she spoke was almost more disturbing than the deception itself. There was no romantic regret. Only calculation. The naked logic of someone who had chosen fraud as a survival strategy, and only afterward discovered how much damage it could cause. "There were no children," she said more quietly. "No father, no pregnancy, no life growing inside me. Only the performance, the cushions, the potion, the false weight, the manufactured signs. Everything you saw was designed to look real." The silence afterward felt hard enough to touch. Marvella folded her hands. "And the king believed you." A bitter smile crossed Isolde's face. "He wanted to." The words spread through the room like smoke. Fabio rubbed a hand across his face. Loren closed his eyes briefly. Celia remained motionless, carrying the sad severity of someone who had watched young people destroy themselves in pursuit of belonging. Marvella did not move. "Do you understand what you've done?" "I do now." Isolde lowered her eyes. "The court began reacting before I could stop. The hallways changed. The animals became restless. The bond magic hesitated around me." Her voice softened. "The lie started demanding more than I knew how to give." Cassian remained silent, but there was no judgment in his expression. Only recognition. He understood when a lie stopped being personal and began damaging the foundations of an entire territory. Marvella opened Isolde's letter and pushed it toward the center of the table. "You wrote this as a physician," she said. "Not as a lover. Not as a frightened young woman, as someone who knew too much about warning signs to ignore them." She held Isolde's gaze. "Why?" For the first time since entering the room, real fear appeared in Isolde's eyes. "Because I knew I wouldn't survive as just another beautiful woman in the castle." She drew a breath. "I needed to seem necessary, irreplaceable, valuable enough that nobody could set me aside the moment their interest faded." Her voice grew thinner. "I wanted to become impossible to ignore." Marvella studied her for a long moment. There was no forgiveness there. Not yet. but neither was there cruelty. Only the cold clarity of someone who understood exactly how the deception worked, and therefore condemned it with complete precision. "You succeeded," Marvella said. "No warmth, no softness. And now you'll carry the weight of that success." Isolde lowered her gaze. Then the door opened. Reynold entered slowly, cane in hand, wearing the face of a man who had spent the entire walk preparing himself for a blow. The moment he saw the circle of chairs, the gathered elders, and Isolde's expression, he understood before anyone spoke. It did not spare him. If anything, it made the impact worse. He stopped just inside the doorway, motionless, like a man who had walked into the ruins of his own life and discovered they had been organized too carefully to deny. Marvella looked at him without standing. "You're late." Reynold's eyes moved across the room. Isolde, the elders, Fabio, the documents. Finally, Marvella. What was said? "What needed to be said," Marvella replied, "and everything you never wanted to hear." A faint pallor crossed his face, the kind only someone who had loved him for decades would notice. Isolde lifted her chin with visible effort. "There was never a pregnancy." She spoke before he could ask. "There were never any children. It was all a lie." Reynold didn't move. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the exact moment a powerful man realizes he has been manipulated by his own hunger. Marvella's voice remained low, which made it even stronger. "The territory is reacting to the deception. The records show instability. Harvests have already suffered. The castle bond is suspended." She held his gaze. "And you helped create this because you believed what you wanted to believe." Reynold closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, there was pain there. Not the kind of pain that deserved comfort. The raw pain of humiliation. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Marvella corrected. He absorbed the blow without protest, perhaps the first truly mature thing he had done in years. The elders remained silent until Ennio struck his staff against the floor. "That's enough." His voice cut through the room. "We have confirmed fraud, a bond in collapse, and a former Luna whose departure was entirely justified." He looked around the room. "Now we discuss consequences." Marvella nodded. Because that was what this had always been about. Not revenge, not spectacle. Consequences. She placed both hands on the table. "The fraud will be formally recorded. Territorial suspension will remain in effect until the castle's structure is restored through legitimate means. Contracts renegotiated without my consent will be reviewed. Debts incurred to sustain this deception will remain the Crown's responsibility." She glanced toward Isolde. "And Isolde will be judged for deliberate fraud, not as a symbol of whatever fantasy the king chose to project onto her." Fabio opened his mouth. Celia silenced him with a glance. Reynold rubbed his face. "And you?" His voice was quieter now. "What do you want from me?" Marvella looked at him for a long moment. The kind of pain that required shouting was gone. Something else had replaced it. A complete internal order. "I want you to acknowledge before the elders that I left with just cause." She spoke steadily. "I want my property recognized. I want the debts accepted as yours. And I want you to stop treating me as something that can simply be put back where it belongs whenever your pride is ready." Reynold lowered his head. "I was foolish." It was worse than foolish. Her eyes never left his. It was convenient. That struck him harder than anything else, because convenience was exactly what he had chosen. Not dramatic cruelty, not deliberate malice, the dangerous laziness of confusing habit with love. Cassian rose then and stepped forward carrying the records box. He placed it beside the documents already spread across the table. "The older records confirm that appointing a delegated guardian is lawful," he said. "And they confirm that the former Luna's standing remains legally significant until the territory is restored properly." Reynold looked at him, The tension between them was obvious. But this was no longer about men competing. It was about the future being quietly placed within Marvella's reach. She saw it, and she understood something important. For the first time in a very long while, she did not have to choose between justice and dignity. She could have both. Enyo lifted his staff once more. The fraud is confirmed. The kingdom will answer for its failures. The former Luna's name and property will be restored, and Lady Isolde will be punished according to law. A pause. Without excess. Without theater. Isolde closed her eyes. There was no triumph anywhere in the room, only the end of a false position. Reynold remained standing for another moment, looking at Marvella as though he finally saw her clearly. Not as a wife. Not as an extension of the palace. Not as someone expected to endure everything in silence, but as the woman now carrying the moral center of everything that remained. Too late. And yet he finally understood. Marvella stood. The meeting is over. No one objected. She walked toward the door without looking back. Outside in the hallway, Duca waited with a tray of tea and an expression far too controlled to be casual. One glance at Marvella's face told her the worst had already been said. For once, Duca didn't make a joke. That alone spoke volumes. She simply handed over the cup and said quietly, "So it really was a lie." Marvella wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Yes." Duca nodded once. "Good. A beat. Then we can finally treat the rest of it for what it is." Marvella raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Duca's expression remained perfectly steady. "Consequences." And for the first time since the truth began forcing its way into the open, Marvella no longer felt alone carrying it. After the elders left and silence returned to the hallways, the house seemed to breathe differently. It was difficult to explain. Nothing tangible had changed. The walls were the same. The fire still burned. The wind continued tapping against the windows with its familiar autumn insistence. And yet something in the air had settled, like dust after a collapse, not clean, not repaired, but finally still. Marvella remained in the library long after everyone else had gone. She didn't read. She didn't write. She didn't do anything remotely productive. She simply sat with her hands resting on the table and allowed silence to be silence. There was a particular exhaustion that followed mornings like this. Not physical fatigue. Something deeper. The weariness of someone who had held herself upright for so long that, once alone, she could finally set the weight down. Cassian entered several minutes later. He didn't ask permission. He simply opened the door with the respect of someone who understood another person's space, and settled into the nearby chair with the easy confidence of a presence that no longer required an invitation to be welcome. Marvella didn't look up immediately. He didn't force conversation. For a while they sat together in silence, while the fire crackled in the hallway, with the patient rhythm of things that had nowhere else to be. Cassian spoke first. His voice was low, measured. "How are you holding up?" "Still standing?" "That's already better than most people manage after a morning like this." Marvella finally looked at him. His eyes were exactly where they always were whenever something real needed saying. Present. Unfiltered. Never trying to be larger or smaller than the truth. "Reynold is still in the courtyard," Cassian said. "Fabio is attempting to convince him to leave before Jervis says something inconvenient." The corner of Marvella's mouth almost lifted. "Gervas never says inconvenient things." "Exactly," Cassian replied. "It's his silence that worries people." She drew a slow breath and looked down at the records spread across the table. Decades of marriage. Years that had been genuine. Years that had merely functioned. There were memories there. Not the polished memories people preferred to keep. The real ones. The decisions made while exhausted. The silences that lasted too long. The affection that existed but never quite learned how to speak its own name. "I need to talk to him." Cassian looked at her. Reynold? Yes. A pause. You don't owe him an explanation. I know. Her fingertip traced the edge of one document. But some things deserve the right ending. She looked up. Not for him. A beat. For me. Cassian was quiet for a moment, then nodded. That was the kind of man he was. The kind who understood when a decision wasn't his to make. Marvella stood, smoothed her clothing, and walked toward the door. She paused with one hand resting on the wood. Stay here. It wasn't a request for protection. It was the kind of sentence that meant, you matter enough that I want to know where you'll be when I come back. Cassian understood. I'll be here. She walked into the courtyard. Reynold stood with his back to the house, leaning on his cane and staring at the trees. There was something lonely about his posture now. The posture of a man who had spent his entire life at the center of every room and had suddenly discovered what it felt like to stand at the edge. Fabio had disappeared. In Marvella's private opinion, that was genuine public service. She approached without hurry. Reynold heard her footsteps. He didn't turn immediately, as though he needed a few extra seconds to arrange his face. When he finally faced her, she saw an expression she had rarely witnessed before. Not simple regret. Something older, heavier. The look of a man who had spent all morning doing the math and deeply disliked the answer. I needed to see you. I know, Marvella said. That's why I came down. They stood facing each other in the cold courtyard while the wind stirred their silver hair and decades of history lingered between them. What she said was true, Reynold began. The words required effort. I wanted to believe her. I understand that now. I knew from the beginning that something felt wrong, but I chose not to examine it because what she promised was exactly what I wanted most. Marvella folded her arms loosely. Not defensively, simply listening with her whole attention. And what I needed was never said. Reynold closed his eyes briefly. No. Why? Such a simple question, which was precisely why it took him so long to answer. Because I thought you would stay no matter what. His voice was quiet. You always had. A pause. I became so accustomed to your presence that I mistook it for consent. He inhaled. And because I never learned how to ask for what I needed. Another pause. I only learned how to expect you to provide it. Marvella listened until he finished. There was no anger left, only the deep exhaustion of finally hearing something spoken aloud that she had known for years, but never had the luxury of naming. You loved me in a very convenient way. Reynold didn't look away. Yes. You took me for granted. Yes. And when I stopped being guaranteed, you replaced me with a promise that never even existed. His jaw tightened, not from defense, from shame. Yes. The third answer carried more weight than the previous two combined. Marvella looked at him. The man who had been her husband for decades. Her king. The father who had remained distant even from his own children. The partner in a marriage that worked until it didn't. There had been love somewhere in that story. She knew that. But love that isn't tended becomes habit. And habit that is never questioned eventually becomes abandonment, wearing the disguise of stability. I'm not returning to the castle. Reynold stood motionless. Marvella, it's not a punishment. She interrupted gently. It's simply the truth. Her voice remained calm. I don't want that life anymore. Not because it lacked value. It had value. She glanced toward the house. But I built something here that belongs entirely to me. A pause. Something that doesn't require me to be convenient for anyone. Reynold looked at her for a long time. And for the first time, she saw something she had never expected. Recognition. Not the admiration that should have arrived years ago. The kind of respect that appears when a man finally stops placing his own needs at the center of everything and begins to see what has been standing before him all along. Does he take care of you? His voice was quieter now. His eyes flickered briefly toward the house. Marvella didn't pretend not to understand. He walks beside me. A small pause. That's different. Reynold nodded slowly, as though the distinction landed exactly where it was meant to. So, this is it. This is it. The wind moved between them, carrying fallen leaves and the scent of damp earth. Marvella saw the exact moment acceptance settled into him. Not dramatically. Simply the way a traveler reaches the end of a road he chose poorly, and finally understands that no amount of wishing will change where it leads. The debts will remain with the crown, he said. The contracts will be reviewed. Your property rights will be protected, and your name will be formally cleared before the council. Marvella waited. And Isolde? Reynold rubbed a hand across his face. She'll be judged according to law. Exile, most likely. His voice was tired. No violence. No unnecessary spectacle. A pause. But the lie won't be buried as though it cost nothing. Fair. For a brief moment, she caught a glimpse of the man he might have become if he had learned earlier to value what he possessed instead of chasing what he lacked. But late revelations do not rewrite stories. They only close chapters. I was a reckless man. For the first time all morning, his voice carried no armor. Yes, Marvella said. Then her expression softened slightly. But you still have time to become a better king. He looked at her with something that contained gratitude, shame, and grief all at once. A combination too tangled to separate. There was nothing left to say. Marvella inclined her head, not a bow. Simply the gesture of someone closing an old book after reading the final page. Then she turned and walked back inside. Duca was waiting in the hallway with her arms crossed and eyes alert. Marvella passed without stopping. It's finished. That was all she said. Duca uncrossed her arms. So can I finally put the soup on without worrying that someone else is about to create another crisis? Marvella didn't answer. But the sound of her footsteps had lost the weight they had carried all morning. Duca understood. Back in the library, Cassian stood by the window watching the courtyard. When Marvella entered, he turned. He didn't ask questions, didn't request explanations. He simply looked at her with that steady presence that never demanded more than she was willing to give. Marvella walked over to him. Together they stood at the window watching Reynold mount his horse and ride away slowly, surrounded by guards and carrying the burden of an entire morning on his shoulders. Is it over? Cassian asked quietly. This part is. He turned toward her. And the next part? Marvella looked beyond the hill, beyond the fields, beyond the wolves running through the tall grass, toward the life she had built with her own choices after everything else had fallen apart. The next part, she said softly, starts now. And for the first time in a very long while, there was more than strength in her voice. There was something remarkably close to freedom. The first thing Marvella felt when she returned to Golden Hill was not relief. It was weight. Not the weight of a tired body after a long morning spent among exposed truths. Not the weight of age that made her knees complain when she climbed down from the wagon. Something deeper than that. Rarer. The weight of a decision finally completed. There was a strange stillness inside that feeling, as though the world had finally stopped demanding her next reaction and, for the first time in years, allowed her to simply exist. Duca opened the front door before the wagon had even come to a complete stop. Well? She asked without ceremony, wearing the expression of someone who had spent the entire day holding herself together through sheer discipline. Marvella climbed down slowly, keeping one hand on the side of the wagon a second longer than necessary. Cassian watched closely. He didn't offer help that might feel patronizing, but he was ready if she stumbled. She appreciated that. She appreciated even more that he understood the difference between support and intrusion. It's settled, she said. Duca released a long breath. And the king? He learned too late that the truth has a long memory. Jervis appeared behind her carrying a pot of soup, as though he had sensed the moment with the precision of an old grandfather clock. And the elders? They confirmed the suspension has ended, Marvella replied. And my appointment as delegated guardian has been formally accepted. Duca closed her eyes briefly in relief. Jervis simply nodded, as though he had always known this would be the outcome, and found it mildly offensive how determined powerful people were to complicate what basic logic had already settled. Cassian stayed beside Marvella as she entered the house. He didn't rush to speak. He didn't press her with questions. Only after she sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup in front of her did he pull out a chair and sit across from her with the natural ease of someone who had quietly become part of a place without ever claiming ownership of it. "So," he asked, "do you have peace now?" Marvella considered the question honestly. "I have a different kind of weight. Before, it was humiliation." She glanced at the steaming soup. "Now it's responsibility." Cassian tilted his head. "Does that frighten you?" "A little." "Good." She looked up. "That means you're still alive enough to respect the size of what you've accomplished." Duca walked behind her carrying a folded blanket and draped it over Marvella's shoulders without warning. "And the size of what you're still going to accomplish," she added. Marvella raised an eyebrow. "You say that as though you know something." "I know many things." Duca looked entirely pleased with herself. "I just don't reveal all of them because I enjoy suspense and have a reputation to maintain." Jervis placed the soup pot in the center of the table. "Letters are arriving from the castle. 3 already. 1 from the accountant, 1 from Counselor Fabio, and 1 without a signature but carrying enough panic to almost certainly belong to the king." Marvella exhaled softly, not impatiently, simply acknowledging the fact. Paper had returned to its proper place. It was paper again, not a threat. "I'll read them later." A comfortable silence settled over the kitchen. The house smelled of soup, firewood, and clean linen. Outside, the wolves were playing in the yard. One of them, probably Bronze, whose confidence exceeded his judgment by a significant margin, let out a sharp little howl, immediately followed by another wolf's offended bark. Duca walked to the window. "They're chasing each other's tails again." "That's a perfectly respectable activity," Jervis said. "Says the man who once watched 7 horses and 4 dogs run in circles because someone dropped a biscuit." Marvella almost smiled. Cassian noticed. The almost smile was enough to ease something in his shoulders. He watched her with the care of someone who had no interest in turning healing into a performance. There was something beautiful about that. Not the beauty of youth, not the drama of hurried passion. The quieter beauty of a presence that demanded no immediate payment. Marvella thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about what still needed closing. "Will Reynold come?" Duca made a face. "He sent Fabio to say he'd like to speak with you within the next 2 days." "And Isolde?" Duca grew more serious. "She's under medical supervision at the castle." A pause. "Not as a prisoner, as a witness, and as someone responsible for her own actions. The council is deciding whether formal exile will be imposed." Marvella nodded slowly. Part of her had expected to feel harsher toward Isolde. But the truth was more complicated. The young woman had been both architect and instrument, and while Marvella would never confuse compassion with absolution, neither did she see any value in turning another woman into a public monument of shame simply to protect the pride of men who had participated in their own downfall. She didn't lie alone. Cassian met her gaze. No. And she wasn't the only one who was afraid. Duca leaned against the counter. "Does that mean you forgive her?" Marvella took her time answering. "Not exactly." She set down her spoon. "Forgiveness is too large a word for what happened." A pause. "But I have no desire to sentence her to a lifetime of humiliation. She'll have to live with what she did. Her voice softened. For someone who couldn't face her own truth, that's consequence enough. Jervis nodded as though that made perfect sense. And Reynold? Marvella rested her spoon against the bowl. Reynold is going to learn how to live without taking me for granted. The sentence landed heavily in the center of the kitchen. Cassian watched her carefully. There was no anger in her voice now, only order. A kind of inner alignment that had finally settled into place. That was what he had seen in her from the beginning. Not merely a fallen queen, not merely an exiled Luna, but a woman who had lost everything supporting her old identity and still refused to become small. Later that evening, as dusk settled over Golden Hill, Marvella found Cassian standing near the eastern fence watching the wolves. His hands rested behind his back. He looked completely at home, as though the land itself had accepted him long before anyone formally invited him to stay. You look like you belong here. He turned toward her. That's how it feels when there's enough order to be peaceful without becoming restrictive. I thought you preferred the chaos of the hills. I like chaos when it serves a purpose. A faint smile touched his lips. The rest is just wasted energy. Marvella stood beside him. Golden Hill stretched before them. The gardens, the old stone walls, the windows glowing warmly one by one as Duca moved through the house lighting lamps. It wasn't the castle, and perhaps that was exactly why it was better. There's still something unresolved. Cassian didn't seem surprised. What? You. For the first time, something shifted behind his calm expression. You helped me when I was nothing more than a woman with boxes, records, and carefully organized anger. She looked at him directly. You came when I needed facts. You stood where support was needed. The dust has finally settled. A beat. So tell me, what do you want now? Cassian considered the question. Long enough to be honest. Not long enough to evade it. Do you want the simple answer or the truthful one? The truthful one. He nodded. I want to stay. Marvella held his gaze. He didn't look away. I want to stay because I like this house. I like the wolves. I like the way Duca looks at me as though she's already decided whether I'm acceptable and simply hasn't issued the official report yet. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. I want to stay because you turned exile into rebuilding. His voice softened. And because when you're nearby, the world feels less dishonest. The words weren't rushed. They weren't offered as a grand declaration. They existed because they were true. Marvella drew a slow breath. The evening air touched her face. Her heart felt slower than it should, and completely alive. Then stay. Cassian didn't smile immediately. He simply looked at her as though that permission meant more than any dramatic promise ever could. Perhaps it did. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. I don't want a man who sees me as a late rescue, or a prize, or a broken woman who finally found safe harbor. She turned fully toward him. I want someone who walks beside me, someone who sees all of me, the losses and the strength. Something in his posture shifted, exactly the amount sincerity deserved. I can do that. I know. The answer was simple, which made it powerful. The following morning, Reynold came to Golden Hill. No royal procession, no trumpets, no ceremony. Only 2 guards, a heavy cloak, and the face of a man who had endured enough humiliation to finally understand the scale of his own arrogance. Marvella received him in the main hall. Duca stood near the back. Jervis remained by the door. Cassian stayed nearby. Present. Respectful. Reynold looked around and, perhaps for the first time, understood this was no longer his home, his stage, or his story. I came to finish this. Finally. He inhaled deeply. The Crown will assume the debts. The Council confirmed the contracts were renegotiated without your consent. Pedroso is being removed from his position. Fabio is being reassigned to archival duties. He hesitated. And Isolda. If the council approves, she'll be sent north under medical supervision. Marvella held his gaze. And you? He lowered his eyes briefly. I'll answer for what I've done. There was relief in the admission, not because it was small, because it was more than he would have been capable of saying only days earlier. Marvella tilted her head slightly. Do you still love me? The question wasn't emotional. Some truths simply deserve to be carried all the way to the end. Reynold took his time, which made the answer honest. Yes. His voice was quiet, but not in the right way. A pause. And too late to change what happened. The truth repaired nothing, but it closed the door. Marvella nodded. Then this ends here too. I know. She looked at him calmly. There was no triumph in seeing him broken, only completion. And some endings are a form of justice all by themselves. You may go. Reynold lingered for one final second, as though searching for a last sentence that wouldn't wound what was already wounded enough. He found none. And perhaps that was for the best. When he left, the door closed softly behind him. No thunder, no dramatic finality, just the natural ending of something that could no longer support its own weight. Duca spoke first. That was suspiciously civilized. Her theatrical disapproval earned a sound from Gervas that might have been laughter. Cassian simply looked at Marvella. And Marvella realized something with startling clarity. For the first time in a very long while, she wasn't being seen as an ex-Luna, or a discarded wife, or a woman defined by what had happened to her. She was simply herself, and that was more than most people ever allow. The months that followed unfolded the way healthy rebuilding often does, without spectacle, without urgency, without glamour. The letters arrived, the debts were restructured. The council formally recognized the territorial restoration. Isolda was exiled under fair conditions, given enough resources to survive, and spared the unnecessary cruelty of public humiliation. Marvella never visited before she left, but she sent a blanket, medicine, bread. It wasn't forgiveness, it was humanity. Reynold remained at the castle and faced the consequences that belonged to him. There was no reconciliation, no return, only accountability, delivered firmly and without theatrics. And then, for the first time in years, Golden Hill truly became home. The wolves grew. Duca became the organizing heart of the household with an authority that required no permission. Gervas taught younger generations how to care for land and animals without arrogance. Cassian stayed, not as a guest, not as a temporary arrangement, but as a chosen and mutual presence. And Marvella, who had once been humiliated before an entire court, found herself sought out by younger women, widows, advisors, daughters of noble families, all wanting to know how a 78-year-old Luna had rebuilt her dignity and made a king pay the debts that were rightfully hers. She always answered with the calm certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime learning what things were truly worth. First, never let anyone treat you like leftovers. Then she would smile. And read the paperwork. Always read the paperwork. One bright spring morning, a year later, Marvella presided over a small gathering in the gardens of Golden Hill. It wasn't a mating ceremony, or a court ritual, or a succession event. It was something simpler, and far more lasting. The formal transfer of stewardship for the hills to the network of caretakers, wolves, neighbors, and allies that had grown around her. Cassian stood beside her. Duca beside Gervas. The wolves wandered freely across the grass. The air smelled of fresh earth, blooming flowers, and bread cooling in the kitchen. When it was her turn to speak, Marvella lifted her face toward the sky and realized that for the first time in decades, she wasn't saying goodbye to anything. I was once a Luna to a king, she said. Her voice was steady. But that is not what defines me. The crowd listened. What defines me is what I did after the ground disappeared beneath my feet. A breeze moved through the garden. I learned that love without respect cannot sustain a home. She glanced toward Cassian. I learned that dignity does not age. Then toward the hills. And I learned that life can begin again, even when the world insists it's too late. Cassian reached for her hand, lightly, by choice, never possession. Marvella turned toward him and smiled, a real smile, the smile of someone who had finally come home to herself. Epilogue. Months later, Golden Hill remained wonderfully alive. The house smelled of dried herbs, wood smoke, and warm soup. The wolves slept in oversized baskets beside the fireplace. Duca complained that the place had become entirely too organized to be natural, which was her preferred way of admitting she was happy. Jervis taught 3 young apprentices how to prune rose bushes without removing the soul of the plant. And Cassian, now fully woven into both the household and Marvella's life, closed the windows each evening because he knew exactly which draft made her complain about her knees. Marvella sat by the fire and watched it all with the serenity of someone who had survived humiliation and emerged not broken, but crowned in a different way. She never returned to the castle. She didn't need to. She had something better now. A home built on truth. A love rooted in respect. And the certainty that sometimes the greatest triumph isn't revenge, or vindication, or reclaiming what was lost. Sometimes the greatest triumph is simply remaining standing long enough for life to change sides.